Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this CityTalks forum. This is jointly hosted by the University of Tasmania and the City of Hobart. Firstly, as a reflection on both institutions' recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University and the City would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, who are the custodians of the land upon which we are meeting. Tonight, I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present. My name is Anna Reynolds and I'm Lord Mayor of Hobart. I'd like to acknowledge a very special guest, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, who is the Mayor of Christchurch, and she's joining us tonight from New Zealand. I'd also like to warmly welcome our other panellists, Dr. Tony Press, who is an adjunct professor at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, and Chloe Power, who is an Antarctic expeditioner researcher, and she's also the Hobart representative on the Antarctic Youth Coalition. I'd also like to welcome Professor Rufus Black, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, who joins us, and Rufus will close the forum with some remarks at the end of the forum. So these CityTalks are a fantastic initiative of the City and the University, and they are Hobart-focused conversations, and they're designed to build connections, to allow for an exchange of ideas, particularly ideas about the future for our city and future development of the City of Hobart. Just a few housekeeping notes before this evening's forum gets underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions. I'd love to receive your questions, and I will aim to get those asked of the panellists later. So you can type them into the Q&A function, and we will try and get to some of those. We'll also be conducting a couple of audience polls during this session, so we'd love it if you would give your thoughts as part of those polls as well. And finally, the lecture is, the forum is being recorded and will be available, can be accessed on YouTube and SoundCloud later. So tonight we are talking about Antarctica's role in Hobart's future. And we have had a lot of excitement and celebration around Antarctica in the last week with the arrival of the Nuyina to its home port of Hobart. So to get tonight's forum underway, we have a special recorded message on board Australia's new icebreaker from the Captain Gerry O'Doherty, and he was the master of the voyage from Europe to Hobart recently. I'll pass over to Gerry.
Hi, I'm Gerry O'Doherty. I'm speaking with you from the bridge of the RSV Nuyina, Australia's new Antarctic icebreaker. Right now, we're arriving in Australia for the very first time to bring Nuyina to her new home of Hobart. Nuyina means Southern Lights in Palawakani, the language of Tasmanian Aborigines. We've been on a 6-week journey that's taken us from Vlissingen in the Netherlands to Hobart here in Tasmania. Covering 24,000 kilometres, it's nearly halfway around the planet. Hobart is the home port of this impressive new ship that can carry up to 117 expeditioners, 30 crew. It's 160 metres long. It can carry 1.9 million litres of fuel. The delivery voyage has confirmed what a truly powerful scientific research vessel the Nuyina is. The crew and I have been fortunate to test her capabilities over this long sea journey, and she hasn't ceased to impress. For me, it's a monumental occasion to deliver this brand new icebreaker to Australia. It's been custom designed and built by Darman for the Australian Antarctic Division, and it will be operated and maintained by Serco. I can assure you the people of Hobart are going to be blown away when they see the size of this ship. It's very impressive and very imposing. The ship's size also signifies Australia's strong connection with Antarctica and Hobart's role as a gateway city to the Antarctic. Once the Nuyina arrives in Hobart and settles there, I'm sure she'll become as much a part of the identity of Hobart as the Aurora Australis did for 30 years. I started on the Aurora Australis over 20 years ago as an integrated rating and worked there as captain in the last years of the ship. Quite a few members of the crew of the Aurora Australis have come to the Nuyina, and they bring with them a wealth of experience gained over a long period of time serving in the Australian Antarctic program. Hobart is a port city. In fact, it's one of the deepest ports in the world. Many of the scientists that will sail in the Nuyina call Hobart their home. They work at institutions like the Australian Antarctic Division, the CSIRO, the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies, otherwise known as IMAS, and the University of Tasmania. I regularly talk with the scientists that work in the Australian Antarctic program, and the work they do continually amazes me. If we're to look after our oceans in Antarctica, these are the people we need, armed with their knowledge that can make a real difference. From what I've seen of the ship so far, you have a lot to be proud of. It's indeed an honour and a privilege for me to be at the helm of Nuyina, along with the crew, to deliver this new Antarctic icebreaker to her home port of Hobart.
It's now my pleasure to welcome the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, the Mayor of Christchurch. Leanne's third term as Mayor of Christchurch will be her last term after just over 30 years of public service. Leanne served for 23 years in the New Zealand Parliament, including as a cabinet minister, and I think came to Hobart during that time. Leanne represented an electorate that was very hard hit by the 2010-2011 Canterbury earthquakes. And as a result of that, Leanne became a champion for resilience and building back after disasters. Leanne supported the establishment of the Christchurch Antarctic Office and championed the development of Christchurch's Antarctic Gateway strategy. Leanne's also been a really important influence in and partner in the Antarctic Cities project, which studied the relationships between the five key Antarctic Gateway cities: Hobart, Christchurch, Pontorentis, Ushuaia and Cape Town. And it's been a really good project. It's only really just wrapped up, and it has been a chance for us to all reconnect. So I will now hand over to Leanne to share her insights as another of our Antarctic Gateway cities.
Kia ora koutou katoa, and thank you, Anna, for the invitation to Christchurch to contribute to this conversation on how Hobart's future is shaped by its strong connection and global stewardship role in Antarctica. Now, I'm going to talk about the Christchurch Antarctic Gateway strategy, which has provided us with a strategic framework for thinking about our own future. It is very much built on our strong connection with the heroic age of exploration, coupled with the traditional knowledge of iwi Māori and the importance of scientific research in this significant region. Christchurch's involvement in Antarctica is underpinned by three core values. The first is kaitiakitanga, which speaks to guardianship and protection of the environment, something that I will come back to. This reflects our custodial responsibility to uphold the values of the Antarctic Treaty, to maintain the Antarctic region for peace and science. The second is manaakitanga, the showing of respect, generosity and care for others. This recognises we're a welcoming host city for national and international agencies and partners, including a number of national Antarctic programs and bodies like COMNAT. The third value is exploration. Our city has a strong history of exploration from early Māori all the way through to our current profile as a city that is open and keen to explore new ideas and experiences and new ways of doing things. I think the slides are running ahead of my presentation, but if we could go back to the second slide, because I want to just comment on kaitiakitanga. If we could just go back one more, which refers to a quote at the conclusion of the report that Anna's just referred to, Antarctic cities from gateways to custodial cities. And it's got this wonderful expression, The notion of custodianship draws from First Nations knowledge systems, which for hundreds of generations have engaged with a diversity of embedded, reciprocal, and holistic socio-ecological practices of care and management of land, sea, and sky. When I speak of this sense of responsibility, it is kaitiakitanga that draws on te ao Māori, the Māori worldview. And it is a word that means more than stewardship, guardianship, preservation, and protection, and yet it is all of these. It recognises the relationship between everything and everybody in the natural world, there being no distinction between people and their environment. It is completely independent of ownership in a European sense. It is seamless and all-encompassing, making no distinction between whenua, moana, and rangi, land, sea, and sky. It ensures any use is sustainable because it is an intergenerational responsibility, past, present, and future. The duty of care owed as much to our ancestors as to our children's grandchildren. This captures the essence of our collective responsibility to Antarctica. And if we could change slides. As the Christchurch Antarctic Gateway strategy states, Christchurch is an Antarctic city where we celebrate and realise the value of our gateway status for the benefit of the city and the nation for current and future generations. The strategy's got 3 priority areas with implementation plans under each. The 3 are welcoming and delivering excellence. That is about being a friendly and welcoming host city to international programs using our gateway, connecting them to businesses and locals alike. Connect and Excite is the priority that engages locals and visitors in our Antarctic Gateway heritage and connections and excites them about the science that is being undertaken today. And then Share Knowledge and Champion Climate Change Action talks to encouraging scientific collaboration and developing school programs that are focused on Antarctica and climate change. When I think of our strengths and the aspirations we share with Hobart, then it's not so much the high quality air and seaport infrastructure or the strong industry base with expertise and experience supporting Antarctic programs that come to the fore, nor does the fact that we host several national Antarctic programs in ComNap. I guess, and if you flick through to the next slide, which just links ComNap to the University of Canterbury's Gateway Antarctica, and then flick through to the next slide, I think one of the most significant of our strengths is the rich and authentic Antarctic heritage connection we have with the region. We have a large concentration of Antarcticans who possess a depth and breadth of knowledge of the Antarctic region, whether through the University of Canterbury's Gateway Antarctica or other connection. Our heritage links are well represented through the International Antarctic Centre, Canterbury Museum and Antarctic Heritage Trust, as well as public exhibitions and installations. If we can flick slides. I've got images more than a century apart which show the public interest that has always been excited by our link with Antarctica. Shackleton's Nimrod departing on the 1st of January 1908 attracted in the region of 50,000 residents to farewell them. I think we had about 60,000 residents at the time. The other shows the Antarctic Air Day in 2018, where the US Antarctic program had an open day for 2 C-17 Globemasters, and again, thousands turned up. We publicly celebrate the connection every year with the season's opening festival, Days of Ice, which involves 2 weeks of events, exhibitions, polar films, speaking engagements, and children's activities, which are really important. This has focused attention on the significance of Antarctica to scientific research and the impact of climate change. There's much that I could cover. However, I wanted to conclude by saying that Christchurch is proud to have been a partner in the Antarctic Gateway Cities project and happy to support this conversation as a result. We're very excited by the Antarctic Youth Coalition that has been spawned from this project, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Chloe Power, who's pictured here with the likes of our own Caleb Fraser on the left. It is they and their generation that represent the way of the future. My closing words are a Māori whakatoki or proverb, kia whakatomori, te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on my past. We are immensely aware that we stand on the shoulders of giants and we take their spirit with us to tackle the challenges that lie ahead. That is a message for us all as we explore what it means to be an Antarctic Gateway city in the 21st century, as Hobart does tonight. Thank you once more. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That's fantastic. And for the audience, if there are questions you'd like to ask Leanne later, please use the Q&A function now, and we can ask some questions in a little while. Now it's time for me to hand over to Dr. Tony Press. So Tony is an adjunct professor at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies here at the University of Tasmania. He was CEO of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems CRC from 2009 to 2014. And that followed a decade of being director of the Australian Antarctic Division. Tony is chair of the Tasmanian Antarctic Gateway Advisory Group, which was established by the Tasmanian government to help build the opportunities in the Antarctic sector. And Tony also undertook a very in-depth report for the national government, the 20-year Australian Antarctic Strategic Plan, which he published in 2014. So I'll hand over to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Lord Mayor of Christchurch. That was a very, very inspiring sense of place. And we have so much in common. We as Southern Hemisphere cities, we as claimants, we as occupiers of First Nations countries who looked south and saw the Antarctic Southern Lights way before the country was colonised by Europeans. As a matter of fact, as you heard earlier, the new research vessel Nuyina is called after the Southern Lights, and this is just a wonderful acknowledgement of those long contributions that go back for millennia. In terms of scientific involvement in Antarctica, Hobart's had a connection since the 1800s with various important scientific personages coming to this part of the world and not only trying to discover Tasmania and what Tasmania had to offer for science, but also pondering the atmosphere, pondering the skies, and thinking about the contribution that the region to our south has for science and for the world in general. Of course, there was fairly early exploitation of Southern Ocean resources with sealing on the subantarctic islands, with whaling in the Southern Ocean, and with various expeditions to our south. And then, of course, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, which involved Tasmanians from the very start. And it's often thought that, you know, as a state, as a city, as a port, our connections with the Antarctic started around the turn of last century, but in fact, they started well before that. But what is Hobart? Hobart is really a sense of place in the Antarctic icescape and sciencescape. We have a very high concentration of Antarctic scientists, Antarctic science institutions, pathways into decision-making through those institutions or into other institutions, such as the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or the agreement on albatrosses and petrels. We have policy development here and a very, very strong research community that engages not only with scientists and sciencey things in Antarctica, but also with the decision makers and the policy makers. And this creates a diverse, I wouldn't say fully integrated, but I would say excitingly interactive connection between disparate schools of thought and with a community of people that are intensely committed to the Antarctic. And then there are the connections to industry, to service provision, to providoring, and they spread not only through the suburbs of Hobart, but through the whole state of Tasmania. And Tasmania is now an engine room of Antarctic innovation, not only in science, but also in the Antarctic service industry. I'll finish up, because 5 minutes is only 5 minutes, but I'll finish up by saying something really, which I think is probably the most important thing to take out of these considerations of place and future. And I reflect on some of the things you said, Lord Mayor. We have a special responsibility in the future. We as claimant states to Antarctica, we as Southern Ocean countries, we as Antarctic Gateway cities, we have a special place to protect the future heritage, the past history, and the future of Antarctica, not just because it's critically important to New Zealand and Australia in social and economic terms, or even in climate terms. It's also because Antarctica is critical to the future of the world. And we have a very special responsibility to hold that, to look after that, and to make the next generation of people to carry that responsibility forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's now time for me to introduce our third panellist, Chloe Power. And Chloe is I'm going to kick off the Q&A with asking Chloe a question. Chloe is, as I mentioned earlier, an Antarctic adventurer and a science communicator. Since graduating from university in marine and Antarctic sciences, Chloe has spent her time researching subantarctic zooplankton. Recently, also, Chloe has taken on this special role as Hobart's representative on the Antarctic Youth Coalition, which came about through this Antarctic Cities project. And the Antarctic Cities project involved all of us here today, but was led by the Western Sydney University and the University of Tasmania. And the network was formed in Antarctica by a youth representative from all 5 gateway cities. And I think it was a really amazing experience that Chloe had that happened just before the pandemic. So welcome, Chloe. And can I just start by asking a question? As in this role that you have as Hobart's representative, can you comment just on this this idea of custodial cities that both Leanne and Tony have spoken about? What do you think about this idea that people in these cities have this extra responsibility, and what sort of difference do you think it makes to the work that's happening in Antarctica to have these cities that perhaps have this custodial role? Can you talk a little bit about that and what some of the youth network group think about these ideas as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this amazing discussion. So yeah, I'm part of an amazing network of young people called the Antarctic Youth Coalition. And basically going back to that sense of custodianship, we live in Hobart, which experiences the Antarctic blasts of cold weather. We get snow on Konani. We definitely feel that sense of connection to Antarctica physically in our weather. And I think that's a big thing in terms of the custodianship. We do feel like we are connected to a place. In terms of how we can sort of integrate that into conserving Antarctica and how young people, that custodianship, how it can then make us feel more connected and stuff like that. I think it comes down to people usually we want to protect what we love, but how do we know what we love if we don't really know much about a place? So looking back at Leanne's presentation about what Christchurch is doing, and they also have a great amount of science happening in Christchurch, as do Hobart. But I think Hobart could learn a lot from Christchurch's communication and outreach into communities, because I think the everyday Hobart person might not know too much about the scientific jargon and the science going on in Antarctica. So I think if we can get Antarctica more in conversation in communities, schools, arts, events, stuff like that, then I think that would provide people with more knowledge about Antarctica and make them feel more connected to it, and then hopefully make them feel more of a custodian to Hobart.
Thanks so much, Chloe. There's a little bit of interference with your microphone. It might be knocking against you just for the next time I come to you. Leanne, have you got any particular thoughts on this idea? I mean, you talked about the custodial role, about the Maori tradition. I mean, at a very practical level, what do you think that the 5 cities could do together to really focus on this additional role? Of course, we'll always be gateway cities, we'll always be doing the logistics work, but what's this additional piece that we could, in terms of being custodial cities, that we could really promote our role in the protection of Antarctica? And what can 5 small cities at the bottom of the world actually do for some of these really big global challenges?
I think that I picked up on the First Nations aspect of traditional knowledge as so important for understanding that broader sense of, stewardship and that custodian concept. And that's why I just love that word, kaitiakitanga. There just isn't an English word that is an exact match for it, because it is an intergenerational responsibility. It lies in the past as much as lying in the future. And so, as I said before, it's a responsibility or a duty of care that we owe to our ancestors as well as to our children's grandchildren. So it's that sense of a continuum. And I've gained really a lot, and I think that our country has, as it's looked to understand some of the things that perhaps we haven't understood traditionally as a colonised nation, what we've missed out on in terms of building that understanding. So that's why I've focused particularly on that side of it. And Australia and New Zealand share the same history in that regard. And I really like the fact that the name for your new icebreaker actually reflects the traditional name for something that was seen many generations before the Europeans arrived. So I think we're on the same wavelength in terms of finding that way to connect the traditional knowledge from our First Nations peoples as an integral part of understanding what that stewardship means and that responsibility going forward.
Absolutely. And Chloe, when you met with your coalition colleagues in Antarctica, did you unpack this idea a bit together? Did you talk about, like, what are the aspirations of the coalition in terms of trying to help protect Antarctica more? What do you think, as I posed to Leanne just now, what can we do, 5 small cities in the Southern Hemisphere, what can we do to help protect Antarctica from these huge global challenges?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So when we all met, the 5 of us in Chile, just before we went down south, we talked about what a lot of our cities had already in terms of connecting those cities to Antarctica. And a big standout was Caleb's knowledge all about traditional owners of the land, and Christchurch's communication and outreach in the city. And Hobart has a lot of, as Tony said before, the highest concentration of scientists in the world living here. So we all kind of looked at, okay, what is working in each city? What can we learn from each other's? We all used Christchurch as a really great example of how we can improve our city's connection out of the science space, so that in terms of public talks, engaging Antarctic education in our school's curriculum. So yeah, there's a lot we can do. We're 5 pretty small cities. Cape Town is quite large, so it actually was a bit hard for Cape Town to incorporate Antarctic stuff in their strategies because it is quite large. So it's sort of at the other end of the scale. But I think, yeah, what we can do is just get people talking about it more. That's the main thing, because you never know in 20, 30 years time if we have a vote going out saying, okay, do you want to protect Antarctica? If someone doesn't know anything about Antarctica, then they might be hesitant to read all that information about protecting a place. So I think if we just get Antarctica as a talking piece, get it more into conversation, get it into our communication, our media, our arts. Tasmania is renowned for its arts. I would love to see more Antarctic related events in our arts, throughout Dark Mofo, Mona. I think it would be great. That would really engage Hobart people and Tasmanian people to really feel more connected to Antarctica before they can make decisions on protecting a place that they might not know too much about.
Thanks so much, Chloe. And Tony, I don't know whether this is something you feel that you can comment on, but we have had a question come in that relates a bit to Chloe's comment. It talks about the fact that Hobart and UTAS are home to a number of leading Antarctic art and humanities scholars. And could the speakers talk more about the importance of the development of Antarctic arts and humanities research, both in Antarctica and in the custodial Antarctic Gateway cities? I know science has been more of your focus, Tony, but have you turned your mind to the issue of the arts at all and humanities?
I think some people would accuse me right now of being smack bang in the middle of humanities with the work that I've been doing on geopolitics over the last few years. But I think Rufus might actually might say something about this in the wrap up. But I know that the University of Tasmania is looking very hard at as the university as an Antarctic identity. And that means working across the various portfolios of the university, working interdisciplinary across the university, and with other institutions. In the time that I've spent working in the Antarctic sphere, which is well over 20 years now, I've worked a lot with visual artists, with recording artists, with poets, playwrights, musicians, people that have had various interests in the Antarctic and what the Antarctic means in their area of practice. I've also worked very closely with lawyers, social research scientists, and also with people that are deeply interested in behavioural science and the way that people interact with each other, which is very important in Antarctica. So there's a huge scope there, and there's actually a lot more resources unseen in the humanities area here in Hobart than you could imagine. There's whole storerooms full of Antarctic art that have never seen the light of day, except for when they were delivered either to the Antarctic Division or to the museum. There are folios of written work and folios of music. I think exposing that in the way that Chloe has put forward is an opportunity just waiting to happen.
Thanks, Tony. And Leanne, have you got, well, there's been a range of questions that people would like to pose to you in this kind of broad area of culture around, you know, the importance of a national Antarctic museum, the importance of culture, and there was a question about whether you're also doing work at the kindergarten level on bringing Antarctica into the curriculum. I mean, in terms of this work, what do you think's the most significant piece of this sort of arts and culture and museums that you think is really fundamental, particularly for locals, possibly less so than visitors? And how do you support these cultural elements? Do you get a lot of support from the federal government to help you run arts programs? Is it something that the City Council itself is supporting, or are you actually getting engagement from the private sector to support these arts and cultural elements of celebrating Antarctica?
Gosh, that was a short question. Some of you might have noticed me grabbing my phone as a cheat sheet, just to say that New Zealand has run over a large number of years the Artists to Antarctica program, and that particular program was brought about through a range of different agencies. So I think it's Antarctica New Zealand, our national Antarctic program, has been the major sponsor of it, but it has involved businesses as well. And I guess what that's done, and I was just looking at the list of people, you know, photographers, filmmakers, musicians, multimedia, sculptor, you know, and what has happened as a result is that there's been quite a development or body of work across a range of artistic disciplines that have represented Antarctica, including music, you know, which has an ability to connect right across the board. So that's not a Christchurch specific, but really a New Zealand approach to really engaging people in a most personal way with a place that most people won't ever get to. And I think that's the significance. Our whole focus around the season opening, I mean, back in the day when I was a member of parliament, that used to be a cocktail function once a year, and you'd get to see everyone that you hadn't seen. We've built that into a 2-week-long festival, which has involved talks. And when I talk about, you know, talks, it is getting some of the scientists to actually reimagine their perhaps university style lecture as a method of communicating with another generation coming through. The children's activities are all about thinking about the future of Antarctica, and of course the Antarctic Centre itself. It really takes people through a journey of an experience. You do get to put on Antarctic clothing and stand there and get deeply chilled, but people enjoy doing that because they get the sense of the feeling of the place. And the other thing is that then takes them through a journey about the importance of Antarctica to climate science and all of the research that's done down there. I've had the privilege of going to Antarctica, and I've often said that you can't truly imagine the word breathtaking until you've stepped off a plane and experienced that sharp flood of cold air at the same time as taking in this amazing whiteness that has an incredible depth to it that you cannot explain. So we have really tried to reach out in different ways. I'm afraid I haven't worked out how you get it into kindergartens, but I know that a lot of young children look forward to the activities around Days of Ice in order to experience the different things that might be important to them in the future.
Thank you. Now, just shifting gear a little bit, I've had a question in about the Antarctic Treaty becoming modifiable in 2048. And the question maybe for all of the panellists, whoever would like to jump in, is what role the gateway cities could play in decisions involving this treaty, and what can we do to help ensure that the future Antarctic governance and custodianship at that global level. I guess if you could just speak about whether you're concerned about what's going to happen in 2048, and should we as custodial cities be starting to do anything about that, or are you feeling, fairly comfortable about where things are heading at that international treaty level? Leanne, maybe if I start with you.
Well, look, I think the Antarctic Treaty is it is an agreement across nations where we agree not to exploit for political or commercial gain. So it's an anti-exploitation treaty, and I think that we as gateway cities have an absolute obligation to do everything within our power to protect. I often find as a city, though, we get left out of these government to government conversations. And I think that we need to insert ourselves in this conversation, and we need to do so early, because there are interests who would seek to exploit for commercial gain, and we need to make sure that we protect and preserve this environment forever. So I think it is a responsibility of a gateway city.
Tony, have you got thoughts about 2048 and whether we need to be ready for some changes there and what role we could play?
Yes, I do. I'd start off by saying the treaty can be altered now. As a matter of fact, the treaty itself was due for review in 1991, and that review period's passed without review. What the 2048 date is the potential review provisions for the Madrid Protocol, and that includes the indefinite banning on mining. So just to put that into its proper legal context. Now, if one thinks that there is a potential for the mining ban to be overturned in 2048, I think that's a very, very slim possibility. But if you were worried about that, then you don't actually start thinking about that in 2045. You need to start thinking about that now, because this is international politics, international agreements. They are a long, slow grind. The role of Antarctic cities and the role of governments in that discussion actually starts now. We have to think about what the future is we want for Antarctica, and I'm on the side of Antarctica being a place of peace and science, an international peace treaty, an international science treaty, and an environmental protocol that, amongst other things, prohibits mining indefinitely. That's the Antarctica I want. And so my role and my colleagues' role and the people that I work with is to have the intellectual, political, and personal local community discussions about those things, and to make sure that everybody has that knowledge and is able to participate in those discussions, knowing what the reality is and how they may be able to contribute to that future for Antarctica that we all want to see.
Thanks, Tony. Chloe, have you got thoughts about this question, and does the coalition itself have any plans for finding out about the potential challenges with the treaty process and taking more of a role in that?
Yeah, I would say firstly, I am concerned for the Antarctic Treaty beyond 2048, even sooner, like Tony was saying. It has been a very strong document and agreement, though, so that does give me a bit of hope. But for the coalition, I think, like I've said it before, but just getting the word out there, because if the public does have a chance to have their say, come the 2048, if they do happen to have a say to save Antarctica, to protect Antarctica, they need to know more about Antarctica to begin with. And not many people have the privilege to go down to visit. So I think if we can really engage people more in Antarctic topics, so they can be quite informed to make those decisions. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people think Antarctica is just a place that's out of sight, out of mind. And if we remind people that Antarctica literally influences the entire Earth, not just Hobart, not just Tasmania. Even if you live in a landlocked country nowhere near the ocean, we all depend on Antarctica for our survival. It influences our global ocean and climate circulation. So that is really something that a lot of people should be aware of, but a lot of people unfortunately aren't, and you can't blame them, because Antarctica is an area where there's not a lot of information about available to the everyday person. It is usually full of scientific jargon and locked away in that sort of science community, and it's very rare for it to spill out into the community to remind people just how connected we are in terms of our survival.
Thanks, Chloe. I've had a question now about, this is more of a Hobart focused question. Someone's talking about the idea of the Antarctic Precinct at Macquarie Point, and they say that it seems like a great idea to give visible focus to Hobart as an Antarctic hub, but there seems to be a lack of vision or ambition for what it could do. I hope we don't lose this opportunity for lack of commitment. Are there any ideas from the panel about what is going on and what should be the outcome? Tony or Chloe, would you like to pick up on this one?
I'll jump in first if you don't want to, Chloe. One of my jobs in the Antarctic Gateway Advisory Committee is to represent the committee's views on the Antarctic Precinct. Now, our view represent the committee's view to the Tasmanian government on the Antarctic Precinct. So I'll put my Gateway hat on and I'll say that we are very committed to the precinct. We think it is a very, very, very good idea. We think that it should be the entrance to Hobart, the Antarctic Gateway entrance to Hobart, so that everybody that comes to Hobart, drives over the bridge, knows there's the precinct, knows how to get there, can go there. We would like to see it not only as a place where there are Antarctic institutions, but also a place where there's public outreach and where the community can interact with Antarctica. And there are many ideas afoot. The precinct is still being scoped and it is still being discussed between the state government and the federal government. And I expect that sometime in the next 6 months or so, there'll be more public announcements about the precinct. But it really should have things, not just like a static museum, but it should have spaces. I mean, it should have a museum, of course, whatever a modern museum might look like. We should house there the vast resources that we have here in Hobart that are heritage archival resources, such as the archives, the National Archives, that have a huge amount of Antarctic material in them. We should create something like the Scott Polar Research Institute out of that material there in the precinct. It should be a place where people from the public can come and interact with Antarctica, not only Antarctic science, but Antarctic arts, Antarctic sea landscape, the Antarctic community as it's expressed in all of its dimensions. My personal view is that the precinct is one of the most important things that we can do in Hobart to represent Antarctica and to present Antarctica to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Tony. Chloe, have you got any thoughts on the precinct and what you'd like to see there?
Yeah, I agree with Tony. I think a precinct is the #1 way to get the community involved in learning more about Antarctica. I think it should be one of the most top priorities of Hobart's Antarctic Gateway strategy. Yeah, I think because a lot of people will never get to experience Antarctica in their lifetime, but you'll get mainlanders, you'll get overseas travellers travel to Hobart and experience Antarctica, the closest thing they could experience to Antarctica at a precinct, just like Tony mentioned before. And yeah, I'd love to see museums, almost an identical version of the International Antarctic Centre that's in Christchurch. That is an amazing, amazing attraction there, where you really do walk out feeling like you have been to Antarctica. So I think that would be the #1 way to get people involved.
Yeah, I think Leanne, there's a few jealous Hobartians over here hearing about your centre. And there was a very quick question about when is your 2-week Antarctic opening? Is it the same 2 weeks every year? Because I think there might be a few interested visitors.
I was muted because I was saying that's a terrible question to ask us because of COVID. We've had to defer it not to the season's opening but to the season's closing. So we're expecting sometime in February to have our Days of Ice festival. So it's been a bit of a journey in terms of addressing that. And of course we've all had to deal with the challenges of COVID in terms of managing to keep COVID out of the Ross Sea, which we've all been successful in doing. So, congratulations to you for what you've done. But the consequence for us is that the festival's been put on hold.
So I just wanted to ask a final question before I hand over to Professor Black to close the session. I just wanted to ask about science specifically and whether, whether Tony or Leanne or Chloe, you're aware of any particular really new scientific area that could be an area of research or even development of a new solution to some of these global challenges that is really well suited, if not to Antarctica, but to Southern Ocean science or cool water science. Is there any sort of really exciting new area of science and research that the Antarctic cities could sort of get into in terms of a jobs-rich research area that you might be aware of that you can give us some information about?
Oh, that's a very tough question because, of course, that's I'm looking particularly at what I saw was happening on the ice when I went down there in 2014. And they were researching, the impacts of the warming of the ocean. They were researching a whole lot of stuff around because the air is so clear that they can look up into the skies as well as under the ice, so it's such an amazing environment. But I can't think of anything that's not actually being done. But looking at the impact of what, for example, so many degrees increase in water temperature would have on the world as a whole, which is why I think Chloe's really nailed the significance of understanding of what those impacts would be. But so I'm going to bow out of the question. I'm not an expert.
Okay. Chloe or Tony, have you got any particular thoughts on exciting new scientific endeavours that the cities might get into?
Oh, I think there's always new discoveries and explorations going on in Antarctica. Every day there's, people find new species living in benthic environments and whatnot. I found something really interesting though when I was on the Antarctic Cities youth expedition, was around the time when Australia had all those really devastating bushfires, and we were at the Antarctic Peninsula with a Russian glaciologist who was showing us that the bushfire smoke from Australia had reached Antarctica, and some of those sediment particles were actually falling onto glaciers and helping contribute to ice melt. So I found that super interesting, that how connected the whole planet is, that bushfire smoke and sediment can travel that far. So what's going on in our countries can really affect species distribution, climate change effects in Antarctica. So I think, it was a nice reminder, well, not nice, but it was a reminder that just our actions here and what's going on here doesn't just affect us.
Thanks, Chloe. Tony, any very quick observations, exciting new areas of research?
Look, I think I've been in a seminar all day for the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership, and I learned new things today that I didn't know 6 months ago. So the science that we're doing in Antarctica is in fact new science, and it's revealing new secrets every day. I'll hand over to the rest of the session and shut up now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all to our panelists. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of the questions. There's some fantastic ones here across a whole range of issues, but I will now pass over to Professor Rufus Black to provide some closing remarks and close the session.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I think thank you to all of our panelists for a conversation across cities and a conversation that I think at its heart has been about that transformation in our thinking from being gateway cities to custodian cities, and perhaps a conversation that could only properly be had where multiple cities were involved, because as is so clear, it's a global custodianship. It's a project of common humanity for common values and the common good of this vital region. It's a custodianship of our capacity for continued discovery, which we've heard pieces about. It's a custodianship of the opportunity for unique forms of peace on the planet, and for conservation of some incredible resources, but also to be not just custodians, but it's been a language of being champions too, champions for a region that is important for the future of the planet, for the role that it plays, but also for the inspiration that it gives to anyone who chooses to engage with it. It's been a conversation too, I think, that's reminded us that to play that custodianship role, it takes these cities individually and together to be ecosystems for the Antarctic. Ecosystems of science and policy, of logistics, and very importantly of creativity in the humanities in all their forms, so that the widest possible audience can be reached by these insights. of education, of scholarship, and at the end of the day, of community, of communities of people coming together in these places to be the voices for this precious part of the world, and to ensure that, as Chloe talked about, when that vote comes, whenever that day is, that there would never be in doubt that people would vote to preserve these critical values for our common humanity. But I think also in questions and in answers, we saw that there are gaps, and gaps not least here in our Hobart. Leanne's kind of conversation was inspiring, I think, to us here in Hobart. Our need to bring our Antarctic presence together, to make it more visible. The idea of the Antarctic Precinct at Mac Point is a compelling one. And Tony mapped some of that vision that many of us are excited to see happen. So there can be truly that coming together of this ecosystem in a way that is more visible, that's more accessible, and that radiates out, so that that voice of the Antarctic can be wider. And perhaps the glue in it all, and the cause always for optimism, is when once again, just as when children take a day off school to protest for our planet, it's the youth of the planet who connect across old divides to create new alliances that in the end remind us of the kind of true sources of hope, which is that opportunity to be connecting irrespective of our country and our place around critical global missions at this kind of time. And Chloe's presence here as a champion for these new ways of organising, and in doing that around these critical agendas, is just so important. So a conversation, I think, inspiring, important for us in our cities to be changing our mindsets, important for all of us concerned to preserve these values and this place. So I'm sure you'd all join me in a kind of virtual hand clap for our panellists, for Leanne, for Tony, for Chloe, our moderator, Anna Reynolds, for her wonderful kind of hosting of tonight. This has been a great conversation. This evening's video, if you want to go back to it, will be available on the university's Island of Ideas website. And I'd encourage you to kind of share it so that word can get out. And thank you to all the people who posed questions and joined us tonight. It is great to be together in this conversation. Thank you very much.